From the early 1960s onward, as the United States consolidated aircraft carrier strike groups as the centerpiece of its global power projection strategy, Soviet naval intelligence identified the continuous tracking of these formations as both a strategic necessity and a technical challenge, because carriers represented not only mobile air bases, but political instruments whose presence could alter regional balances without warning and understanding their location. Readiness and intent became central to Moscow's effort to manage escalation in a maritime environment increasingly defined by nuclear weapons and rapid response. Unlike earlier periods when the Soviet Navy had been largely coastal and defensive, the post-Stalin era saw a gradual but deliberate shift toward blue water operations, accompanied by the development of an intelligence architecture designed to observe, follow, and assess U.S. carrier movements across the world's oceans. An architecture that integrated signals, intelligence, electronic surveillance, maritime patrol aviation, surface combatants, and later space-based systems into a layered tracking doctrine whose purpose was less to enable immediate attack than to provide continuous situational awareness in crisis and war. This effort reflected a strategic calculation that carriers, while powerful, were also vulnerable once detected, and that reliable tracking could constrain their freedom of action by introducing uncertainty into U.S. operational planning, even if the Soviet Union lacked the capability or intent to destroy them outright in most scenarios. Early Soviet naval intelligence assessments emphasized that the challenge was not detection in isolation, but persistence, because a carrier's strategic value derived from its mobility and unpredictability, and losing contact even briefly could render intelligence obsolete, particularly in a crisis where political signaling and military posture could change within hours. As a result, Soviet planners prioritized the creation of overlapping surveillance zones that reduced reliance on any single sensor or platform, accepting redundancy as the price of continuity. In the 1960s, before the maturation of satellite reconnaissance, this mission relied heavily on long-range maritime patrol aircraft operating from peripheral bases, supported by surface ships tasked with visual observation and electronic collection, a combination that exposed Soviet assets to risk but provided the only means of maintaining contact with U.S. strike groups operating far from land. These early shadowing operations established behavioral norms that would persist for decades, including close but non-interfering maneuvers, predictable patterns of approach, and an emphasis on recording electronic emissions rather than provoking confrontation, reflecting a shared understanding on both sides that miscalculation at sea carried strategic consequences disproportionate to the tactical stakes. U.S. carrier commanders quickly became accustomed to the presence of Soviet intelligence-gathering platforms operating at the edges of formations, and this mutual familiarity reduced the likelihood of accidental escalation, even as it normalized a constant state of observation that blurred the line between peacetime surveillance and wartime targeting preparation. From the Soviet perspective, naval intelligence was not merely collecting data, but constructing a dynamic picture of American doctrine, learning how carriers deployed escorts, managed emissions, and adjusted posture in response to perceived threats. Information that fed into broader assessments of U.S. crisis behavior and informed Soviet decision-making at the highest levels. This learning process was iterative and cumulative, with each deployment adding to a growing archive of operational patterns that allowed analysts to distinguish routine behavior from deviations that might signal impending action. By the late 1960s, Soviet naval intelligence doctrine had evolved to treat carrier tracking as a continuous global mission, rather than a series of regional tasks requiring coordination across fleets and intelligence branches to hand off contact as strike groups transited between oceans, a requirement that drove organizational changes within the Soviet Navy and reinforced the integration of naval intelligence with national-level assessment. The introduction of improved electronic intelligence capabilities further enhanced this effort, as Soviet platforms increasingly focused on intercepting and characterizing the complex web of communications, radar, and data links that defined carrier group operations, recognizing that emissions patterns could reveal readiness levels, command relationships, and even the tempo of flight operations. This focus on signals interception reflected an understanding that modern naval warfare was as much about information flow as physical presence, and that controlling escalation at sea depended on knowing not only where the adversary was, but how prepared and connected it was at any given moment. Throughout this period, Soviet naval intelligence operated under strict political constraints, because any action that appeared overtly aggressive risked provoking incidents that could escalate beyond maritime boundaries. And this constraint reinforced a doctrine of shadowing and monitoring rather than interference, even when Soviet assets operated in close proximity to U.S. forces. Escalation control thus became an implicit objective of tracking itself, as maintaining contact reduced uncertainty and the temptation to assume worst-case intentions, allowing Soviet leadership to respond with calibrated measures rather than reactive escalation. By the end of the 1960s, the foundations of a global carrier tracking system were in place, characterized by persistence, redundancy, and restraint, setting the stage for further expansion in the 1970s and 1980s as new technologies, including space-based reconnaissance, would transform the scale and reliability of Soviet naval intelligence while preserving its core purpose of managing risk in an era of global maritime competition. As the 1970s began, Soviet naval intelligence entered a phase of expansion and consolidation, driven by the recognition that carrier strike groups were no longer episodic instruments of American power, but permanent features of U.S. global posture, deployed routinely in the Mediterranean, Western Pacific, Indian Ocean, and Atlantic, and that effective tracking therefore required not only technical improvement, but institutional endurance, because the intelligence mission had to function continuously across peacetime, crisis, and transition without collapsing under operational strain. This requirement accelerated the integration of naval intelligence with fleet operations, as tracking was no longer treated as a specialized activity performed only during heightened tension, but as a standing task embedded in daily naval routine, shaping deployment patterns, training cycles, and command relationships. Soviet doctrine increasingly emphasized the concept of contact maintenance, the uninterrupted handoff of surveillance responsibility as U.S. carriers moved between operational theaters, a process that demanded coordination between surface units, maritime patrol aviation, electronic intelligence collectors, and shore-based command centers. And this coordination represented a significant organizational challenge for a Navy still adapting to blue water operations. The introduction of purpose-built intelligence collection ships, often lightly armed but equipped with extensive electronic surveillance suites, reflected an institutional decision to accept vulnerability in exchange for persistence. As these vessels could remain near carrier formations for extended periods, recording emissions and visual patterns while relying on political restraint and established norms of interaction to reduce the risk of confrontation. From the American perspective, these ships were an accepted, if unwelcome, presence, and U.S. naval commanders developed standardized procedures for operating under observation, managing emissions discipline, and signaling intent in ways that acknowledged Soviet surveillance without conceding operational control. This mutual accommodation reinforced a maritime environment in which intelligence collection and operational maneuver coexisted in close proximity, creating a dynamic in which each side continuously tested the other's thresholds without crossing them. For Soviet naval intelligence analysts, the data collected during these encounters served multiple purposes, as it not only informed assessments of immediate carrier readiness, but also contributed to long-term modeling of U.S. doctrine, allowing analysts to identify patterns in deployment cycles, response to regional crises, and integration with allied navies, information that was essential for anticipating how carrier presence would be used as a political signal in different contexts. This analytical function became increasingly important as U.S. carriers were deployed in support of crisis management rather than overt combat, because the distinction between routine presence and preparatory posture was often subtle and could only be discerned through familiarity with baseline behavior. Soviet intelligence therefore invested heavily in historical comparison, using accumulated data to flag deviations that might indicate heightened readiness or impending action, a process that reduced uncertainty and allowed for more measured political response. Technological advances during the 1970s further transformed the tracking mission, most notably through the introduction of ocean surveillance satellites that provided periodic but wide-area detection of carrier groups, complementing airborne and surface-based sensors, and reducing reliance on continuous visual contact. Yet, these systems did not eliminate the need for close-in shadowing, because satellite coverage was intermittent and could not provide the detailed electronic and behavioral data required for fine-grained assessment. Instead, space-based reconnaissance functioned as a cueing mechanism, directing patrol aircraft and surface ships toward likely carrier positions and enabling more efficient allocation of scarce surveillance assets, thereby increasing overall persistence without dramatically increasing risk. The integration of satellite data into naval intelligence analysis also introduced new challenges, as it required rapid processing, fusion with other sources, and dissemination to operational commanders in a time frame compatible with fast-moving naval operations, driving improvements in command and control infrastructure, and reinforcing the centrality of intelligence in naval decision-making. Throughout this period, escalation control remained a central concern because the proximity required for effective tracking created opportunities for misunderstanding, particularly as U.S. and Soviet forces operated increasingly close to one another in congested waters such as the Mediterranean, where multiple navies, air forces, and civilian traffic shared limited space. Soviet naval intelligence doctrine emphasized restraint and predictability, instructing commanders to avoid maneuvers that could be interpreted as hostile while maintaining sufficient proximity to collect meaningful data, a balance that required discipline and experience at the tactical level. Incidents did occur, including aggressive overflights and close approaches, but these were generally treated as controlled demonstrations rather than precursors to conflict, and both sides developed informal norms for signaling displeasure and re-establishing distance without escalating to force. From Moscow's perspective, the value of carrier tracking lay not in provoking confrontation, but in preventing surprise, because uncertainty about U.S. carrier location and readiness could create pressure for worst-case assumptions during crises, increasing the risk of escalation, whereas reliable intelligence allowed Soviet leadership to calibrate responses and avoid overreaction. This logic was evident in intelligence assessments produced during regional crises in the Middle East and Asia, where carrier deployments were interpreted through the lens of established patterns, enabling analysts to distinguish between symbolic presence and operational preparation. By the late 1970s, Soviet naval intelligence had developed a mature understanding of carrier operations as a form of political communication, recognizing that movement, posture, and emissions conveyed intent as clearly as diplomatic statements, and this understanding shaped both collection priorities and analytic frameworks. The tracking mission thus functioned not only as a military intelligence task, but as an interpretive enterprise aimed at decoding the language of naval power, a role that became increasingly important as superpower competition at sea settled into a pattern of constant observation under the shadow of nuclear escalation. As the decade drew to a close, the foundations laid in the 1960s and refined in the 1970s positioned Soviet naval intelligence to exploit emerging technologies and organizational experience in the 1980s, when global carrier tracking would reach unprecedented levels of sophistication while retaining its core purpose of managing risk and maintaining strategic awareness in an environment where miscalculation at sea could have consequences far beyond the maritime domain. As the 1980s approached, Soviet naval intelligence entered its most technically advanced phase, shaped by the convergence of space-based reconnaissance, improved electronic intelligence, and institutional experience accumulated over 2 decades of persistent carrier tracking, because by this stage the mission had evolved from improvised shadowing into a globally integrated surveillance system, whose primary function was to maintain continuous situational awareness of U.S. carrier strike groups across multiple theaters while minimizing the risk of escalation in an increasingly crowded maritime environment. The maturation of ocean surveillance satellites provided the Soviet Union with a near-global detection capability that fundamentally altered the balance between coverage and persistence, allowing analysts to locate carrier groups over wide areas and cue other collection assets with greater precision. Yet these systems were never treated as substitutes for close-in observation, because satellite passes were intermittent, vulnerable to countermeasures, and insufficient for detailed assessment of readiness, forcing naval intelligence to retain a layered approach that combined space-based detection with airborne and surface-based collection. The integration of these systems required significant advances in command and control, as raw data had to be processed, fused, and disseminated rapidly enough to remain relevant. And this requirement reinforced the central role of intelligence fusion centers that linked naval intelligence directly to fleet commanders and national decision makers, reducing the latency between detection and assessment. Soviet doctrine during this period emphasized that the value of tracking lay not merely in knowing where a carrier was, but in understanding its operational posture, including air-wing activity, escort formation, and electronic emissions, which together provided insight into whether the carrier was conducting routine presence operations, preparing for contingency response, or signaling resolve during a crisis. The ability to make these distinctions depended on long-term pattern recognition, as analysts compared current behavior against historical baselines accumulated through years of observation, allowing deviations to be flagged as potential indicators of intent rather than noise. U.S. naval commanders were aware of this analytical process and adapted accordingly, managing emissions and maneuver in ways designed to complicate interpretation without provoking confrontation, a dynamic that turned carrier operations into a form of strategic dialogue in which movement and silence could communicate as much as explicit signaling. This interaction underscored the extent to which intelligence and operations had become intertwined, as each side's behavior was shaped by assumptions about how it would be observed and interpreted by the other. Soviet naval intelligence training increasingly emphasized this interpretive dimension, instructing analysts to consider not only what carriers were doing, but why they might choose to be seen or concealed in particular ways, and to account for political context when assessing operational data. Escalation control remained an overriding concern because the density of surveillance assets and The proximity of forces increased the probability of incidents, and intelligence doctrine reinforced restraint by framing tracking as a stabilizing activity that reduced uncertainty rather than as a preparatory step for attack. This framing influenced tactical behavior, encouraging Soviet units to maintain predictable patterns and avoid actions that could be misread as targeting, even as they collected detailed data that would be essential in wartime planning. Bilateral agreements and informal norms further shaped this environment, providing mechanisms for managing incidents at sea and reinforcing mutual expectations about acceptable behavior under surveillance. And these arrangements were treated by naval intelligence as enabling conditions for effective tracking rather than as constraints, because they reduced the risk that routine observation would escalate into crisis. The analytical payoff of this system was evident in how Soviet leadership interpreted U.S. naval deployments. During regional tensions, using carrier movements as indicators of American priorities and thresholds, and integrating this information into broader assessments that guided diplomatic and military responses. Intelligence reporting from this period reflects a high degree of confidence in the ability to locate and monitor carriers, yet also an awareness of the system's vulnerabilities, including reliance on predictable satellite orbits and the potential for deception, leading analysts to treat tracking data as probabilistic rather than definitive. This probabilistic approach represented a maturation of intelligence practice, as it acknowledged uncertainty while still providing actionable insight, reducing the temptation to assume worst-case scenarios in the absence of perfect information. By the mid-1980s, Soviet naval intelligence had achieved a level of sophistication that allowed for near-continuous global tracking of U.S. carrier strike groups under most conditions, fulfilling a key, long-standing strategic objective while preserving the restraint necessary to avoid escalation. This balance between capability and caution defined the character of maritime intelligence competition during the late Cold War, demonstrating that surveillance at sea functioned not only as a means of preparing for conflict, but as a mechanism for managing it, by constraining uncertainty and enabling calibrated response in an environment where misinterpretation could have consequences extending far beyond the horizon. As the late Cold War progressed into the second half of the 1980s, the accumulated effects of continuous carrier tracking reshaped how Soviet naval intelligence conceptualized escalation control at sea, because by this stage the mission was no longer experimental or aspirational, but routine, embedded in daily operations, and reinforced by shared expectations on both sides about the limits of acceptable behavior. And this routinization reduced the likelihood that surveillance itself would be mistaken for preparation for attack. Intelligence assessments from this period increasingly emphasized that predictability, rather than concealment, was often the stabilizing factor in maritime encounters, as both U.S. and Soviet commanders had internalized patterns of approach, shadowing distance, and signaling that allowed observation to occur without triggering defensive reactions, and naval intelligence treated these patterns as assets to be preserved, rather than obstacles to be overcome. This emphasis reflected a strategic judgment that the greatest risk at sea lay not in being observed, but in being misunderstood, and that reliable tracking reduced the incentive for worst-case assumptions during moments of political tension, allowing leadership on both sides to interpret naval movements as calibrated signals rather than as imminent threats. Soviet naval intelligence doctrine during this period framed carrier strike groups as instruments of political communication, whose movements conveyed intent within a shared grammar developed through years of observation, and analysts were trained to decode this grammar by correlating operational data with diplomatic context, recognizing that identical movements could carry different meanings depending on timing, geography, and concurrent political events. This interpretive approach was especially important during periods of heightened tension, when U.S. carriers were deployed to signal resolve or reassurance without crossing thresholds that would provoke escalation, and Soviet intelligence used established baselines to distinguish these signals from genuine preparations for combat. The integration of naval intelligence into national decision-making reached its peak during this period, as carrier tracking data flowed directly into strategic assessments that informed Soviet responses to crises in regions such as the Middle East and Asia, enabling calibrated reactions that balanced deterrence with restraint. Technological improvements continued to enhance capability, including advances in electronic intelligence processing and data fusion that allowed analysts to integrate emissions data with positional information more rapidly. Yet, these advances were treated as incremental refinements rather than transformative shifts, because the fundamental logic of layered surveillance and escalation control remained unchanged. Intelligence reporting from the late 1980s reflects a heightened awareness of the system's fragility, as analysts acknowledged that reliance on predictable patterns created opportunities for deception, and that any significant deviation from established norms could be misinterpreted, underscoring the importance of maintaining professional discipline at the tactical level. This awareness informed training and doctrine, reinforcing instructions to avoid provocative maneuvers and to maintain clear signaling during close encounters, because the cost of miscalculation was understood to be strategic rather than tactical. The gradual easing of East-West tensions during the final years of the Cold War did not diminish the importance of carrier tracking, because uncertainty about U.S. intentions remained, and the intelligence mission continued to provide assurance that changes in rhetoric were matched by corresponding restraint in naval posture. In this sense, naval intelligence functioned as a verification mechanism, allowing Soviet leadership to test whether diplomatic signals were reflected in operational behavior, and thereby reducing the risk that political shifts would be misread. As the Cold War drew to a close, the Soviet carrier tracking system stood as one of the most mature and disciplined intelligence enterprises within the armed forces, characterized by technical competence, institutional memory, and a deeply ingrained commitment to escalation control. And its legacy extended beyond the conflict itself by demonstrating how persistent surveillance, when governed by restraint and shared norms, could stabilize competition rather than inflame it. This legacy underscored a broader lesson of Cold War maritime competition, that intelligence at sea was not merely about preparing for war, but about preventing it by reducing uncertainty in an environment where mobility, proximity, and nuclear capability magnified the consequences of misunderstanding, and that the global tracking of U.S. carrier strike groups represented one of the clearest expressions of this logic in practice. As the Soviet system itself began to strain under economic pressure and political reform in the late 1980s, naval intelligence assessments increasingly reflected an awareness that the global carrier tracking mission, while technically successful, existed within a broader strategic context that was shifting rapidly, because the purpose of tracking had always been tied to managing escalation rather than achieving dominance. And, as superpower confrontation softened, the value of precise situational awareness lay in verifying restraint as much as in detecting threat. Intelligence reporting from this period shows that Soviet analysts paid close attention to whether U.S. carrier deployments matched the tone of diplomatic engagement, treating continuity in surveillance patterns as a stabilizing factor that allowed leadership to assess change without assuming deception. And this function became especially important as political signaling grew more ambiguous during the transition toward arms reduction and dialogue. The tracking system, refined over decades, provided a baseline against which deviations could be measured, enabling analysts to identify not only potential escalation, but also genuine de-escalation, a capability that reduced pressure for preemptive response during a period of institutional uncertainty. At the operational level, the persistence of established shadowing norms contributed to stability as commanders on both sides continued to operate according to familiar patterns, even as political structures evolved, reinforcing the separation between routine surveillance and hostile intent. Intelligence doctrine during this phase emphasized continuity of behavior as a signal in itself, recognizing that sudden changes in surveillance posture could be misread, and that maintaining predictable interaction at sea supported broader strategic reassurance. This emphasis reflected a mature understanding of intelligence as a stabilizing instrument, one that constrained misinterpretation by anchoring perception in long-term observation rather than short-term fluctuation. By the end of the Cold War, the Soviet naval intelligence system dedicated to tracking U.S. carrier strike groups had achieved its core objective of reducing uncertainty in a domain where uncertainty could have catastrophic consequences. And while the Soviet Union itself would soon dissolve, the practices, norms, and analytical lessons developed through this mission endured as evidence that sustained surveillance, disciplined restraint, and institutional learning could coexist within intense strategic rivalry. The global carrier tracking effort thus stands as a defining example of how intelligence competition at sea functioned less as a prelude to conflict than as a mechanism for managing it, demonstrating that in an era of nuclear-armed navies and global mobility, knowledge and predictability were as central to security as force itself. In the final assessment of Soviet naval intelligence's global tracking of U.S. carrier strike groups, the effort emerges not as an isolated technical achievement, but as a sustained strategic practice that shaped maritime competition throughout the latter half of the Cold War, because it demonstrated how intelligence could function simultaneously as a source of military preparedness and as an instrument of escalation control in an environment where miscalculation carried existential risk. The decades-long commitment to continuous tracking reflected a recognition that carriers were political weapons as much as military platforms, and that understanding their movement, posture, and readiness was essential for interpreting American intent during crises without defaulting to worst-case assumptions. This recognition drove the creation of a layered surveillance architecture that prioritized persistence, redundancy, and restraint over dramatic confrontation, embedding intelligence collection into routine naval operations, and fostering a professional culture that treated close observation as normal rather than provocative. The success of this system lay not in its ability to enable immediate attack, a scenario that was rarely realistic, but in its capacity to reduce uncertainty for decision-makers, allowing Soviet leadership to calibrate responses based on observed behavior rather than speculation, and thereby to manage competition at sea within bounds that avoided uncontrolled escalation. Over time, the normalization of shadowing and signals interception created a shared maritime grammar through which both sides communicated resolve, reassurance, and restraint, transforming intelligence encounters into predictable interactions governed by informal norms and mutual understanding. This predictability, paradoxically, became a stabilizing force as it reduced the likelihood that routine presence would be mistaken for imminent aggression, even as surveillance remained intense. The integration of intelligence analysis with operational planning ensured that carrier tracking informed not only tactical awareness, but strategic judgment, reinforcing the view that intelligence at sea was inseparable from diplomacy and crisis management. As the Cold War ended, the dissolution of the Soviet Union did not negate the significance of this experience. because the practices developed through decades of carrier tracking illustrated a durable lesson about modern naval competition, that continuous observation, when paired with disciplined restraint, can mitigate risk rather than amplify it. In retrospect, Soviet naval intelligence's global tracking of U.S. carrier strike groups stands as one of the clearest examples of how intelligence rivalry in the nuclear age evolved away from episodic confrontation toward sustained management of uncertainty, demonstrating that at sea, where mobility and proximity magnify danger, the most consequential intelligence victories were measured not in engagements fought, but in crises that did not escalate beyond control.